Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, here's a treat. Daniel Squadron is the co-founder and executive director of the States Project. Heartland Signal is a States Project property. So we've gotten to know him a bit. Daniel also spent time as an assemblyman in New York, where he learned a lot about how powerful state governments really are. But it's New York. So he also learned politics are as gentle as a hungry tiger, and that creates opportunities for voters. He writes about it in his book. His new book is called The Fourth Estate, and that's what we're going to talk about. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much. And not to immediately come in and correct, but I was in the state Senate, which is an important distinction only to people who are in the state Senate.
I apologize. I knew that, and I just thought the assembly was the word that covered both houses, not in New York. Okay.
And Heartland Signal and the States Project are owned by the same parent, but are not. The States Project doesn't control Heartland Signal. And the last thing is, right, it's the fourth branch, not the fourth estate. But I think we're off on a great foot with each other.
Okay, so that is utterly crazy on my part, and I apologize.
Gives me something to say to get started.
The thesis of the book is that individuals don't need to feel powerless in our democracy, in part because they can make a big difference in states, and states make the biggest difference in our daily lives. Talk about that.
On that, we couldn't agree more. That is exactly the thesis, and I do thank you for reading it and talking about it. Really excited for it, especially because you think so deeply about power and democracy and the interplay, and so I'm excited for this conversation on that basis. So that's exactly right. I actually think that the starting point is people who look at our politics as it's talked about and feel frustrated or powerless. I want to tell them, like, I get it, and I'm actually sympathetic to that. I think admitting that is an important part of reinvigorating our democracy, not because it means we should be let off the hook for having the biggest possible impact, but because it means we need to keep looking until we know that we are having one. I do believe, as you said, that states are the place that impact can be greatest, both because even small amounts of new focus, attention, and activism in states goes a really long way. A lot of state legislatures get decided by 1 or 2 seats that are each decided by a few dozen votes or fewer. But also because states actually aren't sort of small ball when it comes to policy changes. In fact, in the last 15 years, I believe state legislatures have done more harm or good in our country than Congress has.
Well, I want to say, Daniel, that part of the right-wing project in America was to make sure that Congress couldn't do anything, right? And the Supreme Court was part of that. So when Congress doesn't do anything, the burden falls on the states to do a lot. And states have picked that up. They really have. And they have done an amazing thing for, as you say, for good and ill.
When there's a right wing, as you point out, the contemporary one particularly, that really has a goal to have have government be less effective, the state be less effective at all level of government. What they did is they used the idea that they supported states having power to justify undoing federal power, as you point out, to justify gunking up the works in Congress, to justify really unpopular positions that they still hold, like undo Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and unemployment insurance, and making sure the food we eat doesn't sicken us for a contemporary issue of the moment. Yeah. And so what that's done is it's created this world where there's more opportunity in states, because you sort of have an agreement, if we take it up, that this is where the government action should be and could be. And so this isn't about the role of the federal government that was so critically important in ending the evils and horrors of not just slavery, but also Jim Crow and segregation and other unfair laws in our country even more recently. It's about the possibility, if there's been this sort of commitment to states to get things done. So we see that with the fact that even big federal policy like Obamacare actually starts in the states, and you got to give credit where it's due. Romney Care is what it was called in Massachusetts. Hawaii did it as well. But also you see other issues, like when there's one of these big shootings that the country comes together in grief on. And I talk about this in the book, like Newtown, Connecticut, a decade and a half ago. Everyone looks and says, oh, is Mitch McConnell going to suddenly change his position on assault weapons bans or background checks? And of course, the answer is known at the beginning, which is why people hate politics. But meanwhile, a lot of people don't know this, more than a dozen states actually took on gun safety, including with bipartisan support. In New York, Republicans and Democrats voted together on that, and that was true in a lot of other states. On issue after issue, you look to the federal government and you know the answer will be inaction. And then you look around the states and say, wow, something's happening here. How can I do something about it?
One of the best examples of the good and ill and how it matters is Minnesota and Wisconsin. They're two states that are practically identical in terms of their economies, right? And then after Scott Walker won in Wisconsin, he took the government one way and Minnesota went another way. These states were almost identical on all kinds of measures that matter for outcomes for people, and they started to diverge. And in the years since, Minnesota had, to use an example the right would love, a ton more private investment in the state than Wisconsin had. But they also ended up with longer lifespans. They ended up with better health outcomes. They ended up with better educational outcomes. So you're absolutely right. There's an absolute laboratory for the difference that local government makes. Same federal government, nearly the same demographic experience. They started from nearly the same place, and there was divergence.
That's right. And that just speaks to the extent to which states both do big things and also things that are felt in people's lives. And I think it is just so telling when you look at the economic development of the Twin Cities and the economic development of Milwaukee. Now, Wisconsin's a great state and has some real assets to it. And hopefully this year, I think its governance will change. But
heroic politics to fight to win it back.
And in particular, and it's been a multi-year project in the legislature there.
Yep.
I talk about a similar dynamic between northern Colorado and southern Texas in the book. I have a fictional minimum wage family, young family, and I say, where should they live? There's only 50 miles separating through the Oklahoma Panhandle, those two areas. Mm-hmm. Well, in Colorado, minimum wage is $15 an hour. So in Texas, it's only $7.25, which, by the way, is the federal minimum wage, because the last time the federal government changed its minimum wage was the same time the first iPhone came out. Federal government's not acting. So anyway, your minimum wage is about twice as much if you're a minimum wage worker. You have paid family leave in Colorado, so you have your first child. The mother can stay home. In Texas, she loses wages while she's in labor. Then, of course, either parent or both parents, if they time it right, can stay home and still get paid for up to the first 6 months of the kid's life in Colorado, not in Texas. Texas, speaking of Obamacare, still hasn't adopted Obamacare. It hasn't accepted the expansion of Medicaid into the middle class. So even though they're minimum wage workers, if they both work full-time number of hours in a year, they make too much money to be on Medicaid in Texas, but in Colorado, they get it, healthcare. And so I talk about those differences, the really dramatic differences in life. You think of Texas's southern border being more relevant. I got it wrong before. It's southern Colorado and northern Texas. But then here's what's kind of fun, because this book is really about looking past the narratives that are the national ones. Later in the book, I come back to the family. I say, you know what? In Texas, we gotta admit it. For each amount of energy you use, each kilowatt of energy you use in Texas, you're paying about half as much as Colorado. Your housing costs are significantly lower in Texas than in Colorado. Mm-hmm. And if you just trust where people are choosing with their feet, more people in the last half decade have moved into Texas than any other state. And so, by the way, those are outcomes that don't speak to the hard rights policy agendas. I'd actually say they speak to a different time in Texas when it was governing in a more moderate or bipartisan way.
But also got to acknowledge that when you and I look at politics, we're looking at politics, but life is more complicated. It's got a lot of inputs, and state governing it isn't the same binary as the federal government, which is abstract. So you make a lot of different decisions. Collectively, they impact the lives of people in all kinds of ways.
I look, that's such an important point, and I think there's a lot of hope in that too. So to come back both to your first question and that great point you just made, states are a place going to make more difference, but also where the dynamic that we assume is inevitable in the federal politics doesn't hold. And as you know, in the book, I have story after story of surprising outcomes, like in Nebraska, a Democrat who was in the supermajority of the Nebraska Senate is Republican. He was a Democrat from Omaha, the little blue dot in that state, and he was elected into the third position of leadership in the entire chamber, with Republicans voting for him because they just thought he wasn't full of it.
So I want to talk to you about some of this is less policy, but legislative dynamics. And because look, you wrote about a very special type of bipartisan cooperation that you experienced, and I would call it the New York backstab, but maybe a better way to talk about it is the palace coup. I mean, those kinds of dynamics actually weirdly open up possibilities for people who care about issues to get stuff done.
Well, that's true. So in New York, back when I was first elected, I was originally elected to the New York Senate at 28 years old. I beat a 30-year incumbent in a Democratic primary. I got there, and as you point out, a palace coup or some kind of coup. Might have been a Three Stooges coup, if we're being more honest about it. But nonetheless,
Malice in the Palace, I think, was the name of the episode.
Exactly. Shut down the entire state for 35 days. But it was also the case in that same dynamic where in that moment, the Republican Party was trying to regain power, so they were voting as a bloc, that on any issue at all, a single person could choose to shut down the state, to extract a concession on another issue, to make it pass. I talk about an individual who was a colleague of mine named Tom Duane. He was the first openly gay member of the New York State Senate ever. He was also HIV positive, had been an incredible advocate in New York City through the darkest days of the AIDS crisis, for equal rights for LGBT New Yorkers, and in a way that was more universal. And he was desperate to get marriage equality passed. And he was faced again and again with these choices about sort of who do I have to make coalition with to have this core civil rights advance, move forward, and how do I do that in relation to my other progressive goals? Now, he ended up being successful, and New York State did pass marriage equality, but in a very different dynamic, and only with the support of some Republicans, and it was a couple of years later.
Yeah, I mean that also should give people some confidence that at least in the state level, there are moments when you can really accomplish a lot, and what looks to the outside like chaos is actually great opportunity.
So I mean, it really looks like chaos. And by the way, for good reason. I talk about it looking so much like chaos at one point that the New York Post, our local paper back home, superimposed clown faces over all of our faces on their cover.
Yeah.
For a lot of politicians, getting on the cover of a tabloid is, the goal, unless you've been indicted. This was a new version of a low. And it's because, for good reason. I talk about the fact that a half dozen of my Democratic colleagues subsequently went to federal prison. All of this chaos, but the chaos is actually a combination of partisanship, principle, and just personal psychology. You can do great things with it. In New Hampshire, I talk about a woman named Rebecca Perkins Coca, who's this minority leader, only a few Democratic members of the New Hampshire Senate. She worked with a group of Republicans in the leadership that stood up to the Senate president to pass great housing legislation in New Hampshire.
Yep.
I mean, this is the thing. You don't want to watch sausage getting made, but sausage can be really delicious.
So I know this is the main theme of the book, but you do spend a moment on national history and some national things. And sorry to say, I don't think we can spend enough time on the story of the right-wing makeover of America. So, and you, particularly, you spent some time with Paul Weyrich in the book. And I just don't think the country understands the damage that man did, and the things that he created. And I anytime I get a chance for somebody who's talked about it to talk about it again, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about at least two of the things that he created at maybe the suggestion of Lewis Powell that ended up causing so much trouble.
Well, there's an interesting question as to whether Powell inspired Weyrich or Weyrich inspired Powell.
Right.
So there's the famous something called the Powell memo that probably some of your listeners, a very, very knowledgeable group, is familiar with it, sort of the map for the right wing. But Paul Weyrich is a fascinating figure, and I have to say, I have really learned a great deal from him. Just very briefly, Weyrich in his early 20s was like a lot of political operatives. 1964, 65, he worked for a presidential campaign. That happened to be Barry Goldwater, who was the most conservative possible candidate, totally shellacked. Weyrich was despondent. Also in 64 and 65, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act, the Great Society bills. Weyrich is despondent about that. He feels this is the loss of his country. But the most important and upsetting thing that happened to Paul Weyrich in 1964 and 65, when he was in his late 20s, was Vatican II. The modernization of the Catholic Church. He felt like his church had been torn away from him. And so he's upset, sort of the forces of modernity and the bureaucracy. He's working for a moderate US senator, and he's the representative for that US senator on the Civil Rights Coalition, because in those days, the Civil Rights Coalition was bipartisan. And he realizes sitting there, so almost like an epiphany, that this is how you get things done. You have to build institutions and build relationships with elected officials through them. So he quits his job and he founds, to your question, two critical organizations. The first one everyone has heard of. It's the Heritage Foundation, founded in 1972, the author of Project 2025 and a whole lot of other terrible policy and value statements. The other organization is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the most important civic organization in American life most people have never heard of. What it does is it takes those same hard right principles, the idea of bringing back God's kingdom to earth through our government, to states. And it launders on behalf of hard right activists and whichever corporation pays the most, policy to state lawmakers on the right around the country. I didn't even know they existed until I had been in office nearly half a decade. But once you see them, you can't unsee them in American life.
Yeah, really important. And maybe I'll take a whole segment sometime on ALEC and how they work. It's fascinating, terrifying. I teach it in my class at DePaul. So I was thrilled to read that you didn't give them a pass in talking about this history, because it's just so important that people understand that they saw the direction America was going. They saw America becoming, they cared about the environment. They cared about civil rights. They cared about product safety, because some of this was like the automobile companies didn't like being told to put in seatbelts, right? And they said, we need to build institutions that will stop this. And that's, they were successful.
By the way, you probably know this, but Weyrich also founded the first ever conservative television network with a guy named Roger Ailes. That one failed in the 1970s, where Roger Ailes was then the founder of Fox News Channel, and also founded the Moral Majority, which was the coalition of politically very conservative Catholics and evangelical Christians in the later.
It was the effort to take abortion and make it a political issue, which it wasn't at the time. Yeah.
And late in Weyrich's life, he was once asked sort of, who he thought were promising and important politicians coming into the national scene. You know who he said? Mike Pence.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, the book is also towards the end about your path out of the legislature and into the States Project. So talk a little bit about the States Project, why it's important, why you're doing it, what the impact you're having is.
Sure. So in nearly a decade in serving in the New York legislature, I discovered that there was so much power in states that was really only wielded by the worst forces in our politics, and that no single state lawmaker could take that on themselves in the face of these hard right institutions. So I resigned my office and co-founded the States Project with Adam Pritzker. And the reason I did it is just in my district over the period between when Trump was elected and when I resigned in the next 9 months, I had gotten a group of people at a holiday party to get excited about the idea of getting involved in states. And that was so surprising to me that it was an inspiration to start the States Project, and an inspiration for Adam as well. The idea of the States Project is it gives regular folks the chance to become the most important players to help state lawmakers get elected around the country through a coalition or network of giving circles, groups of people who get their own name and webpage and choose a state they want to raise money for. We allow state legislative candidates in the most competitive districts to get off the phone with special interests because they have enough resources, instead of raising money from special interests, to go knock on doors of voters and constituents and introduce themselves. The States Project looks at all of the state legislative chambers that are up for election in any year and figures out the ones where the elections will be most important for who's in control of the chamber, and then creates a process to let giving circles choose which state they want to help fundraise for, and helps candidates in those states run campaigns that are as well run as states are important. And the number one thing we ask for from candidates is go meet your voters. Go meet your voters. There is one other thing we ask for, which is we think it's really important that any candidate we support is committed to the proposition that all people are created equal with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government secures those rights with the consent of the governed. They have to believe in representative democracy. They have to know that effective government is real and important, that fair markets and personal freedom are part of what makes America at its best.
Okay, and this really important work, and it's had an impact on races.
It really has, so in some really significant ways. In Pennsylvania in 2022, no one else believed it was possible, but the States Project helped a bunch of candidates there. And the final seat to flip the Pennsylvania House, done by a single seat, 63 votes. Michigan that year is also came down a couple hundred votes. Unfortunately, we lost the Michigan House in 2024. In fact, in 2024, the States Project was helping in 59 races that were decided by less than 1,000 votes. But as of the time the States Project was founded, and I was fortunate to meet that group of people who started the first Giving Circle and Adam Pritzker, as of that point, in competitive chambers, in competitive races, the right wing was outperforming by about 3 points. So if you looked at the national model, you looked at the top of the ticket, right wing was outperforming about 3 points. I mean, then there was a bonus if you were a Republican state legislator in campaigns. Now in competitive races where the States Project works, the candidates we work with outperform the top of the ticket or the fundamentals by about 3 points. That's a 6-point flip, and it's really important. And here's the reason it's most important. Donald Trump fundamentally believes in the centralization and personalization of power with himself. But the fundamental, most important tool states have is what actually James Madison said they do, which is they are the strongest force we have against monarchy or autocracy, as we would say today, in the country. And so states having the independence to stand up to any attempt to undermine competitive elections is the best way we're going to preserve them.
That is not obvious to people right now. And the Democrats have thought for a long time the Supreme Court was their protector, right? And they outsourced the work of democracy to their lawyers. And I think it went for a very rude surprise in the last few years when they found the court actually just reverted to its historical norm of protecting, rich people's property and not caring about their rights, and that they had to find some other source of protection. And it's been slow to dawn on people. The right wing knew it was the states a long time ago. Some of us watched when Biden was president. Governor Abbott in Texas saying, you don't even get access to the border. We're putting the state troopers in the way. And Biden decided not to fight that fight. But we learned that we needed to, like a book like yours. We learned that states matter. Now we have to figure out how they matter, why they matter, and what we do about that.
Exactly. And, I have to say, I am a true lover of democracy because I think that in democracy, when you win power, it's legitimate and you can be proud of it and use it. And I think winning power any other way is illegitimate. But it is still about winning power. And it is ironic, isn't it, that the movement that talks a lot about democracy now was so dependent on structures that weren't the most democratic.
Yes.
State legislatures are often not the most democratic today because they've been left to such a narrow group of special interests, but they have the potential to be the most democratic because activists, small groups of folks, first-time candidates can get in there. What I say in the book is if you have an issue you want your state legislature to be forced to deal with, get your friends and neighbors, spend a year following the plans that I lay out in the book. And within a year, your state legislature will be forced to deal with the issue you raise. You may win, you may lose, because in a democracy, sometimes you lose, but they'll be forced to deal with it. In fact, I'll say this, go buy the book and read it. If you followed the precepts in the book and after a year, your state legislature totally ignores you, I'll send you a refund.
Okay. That, that's a dangerous thing to say because people are going to be raising their hands whether they bought the book or not.
If you follow the precepts, notice, Edwin, let's not, let's be sure not to edit it out there.
Look, I mean, I lived in a state where one of the reasons why people don't know their state legislators is this interesting phenomena that state capitals are not in the population centers of the states. So traditionally, the big media markets didn't cover it. Like Springfield, Illinois, where I am, right? There are two enormous media markets, Chicago and St. Louis, Missouri. And guess what's exactly in the middle with the weakest signal possible? Springfield, right? And Albany is at the center of New York. The population's somewhere else. So a lot of stuff gets under the radar screen. And part of what you are urging is that people pay attention. And the collapse of local media has made this worse. But now there's alternative media. There's outfits like ours and others that pay attention to what's going on in state capitals, talk about it. So that we just have to tell people, we just have to let people understand, watch your state capital. It's an amazing amount of money and an amazing amount of policy decisions that affect your lives every day.
That's exactly right. Here's what I'd say to folks. If you think things are going great, if you think the democracy is as strong as it's ever been, that there's no regulatory capture that's making opportunity vanish in this country, if you think things are going great, don't worry about it. But if you are worried about the democracy, if you don't like the policy direction of the country, if you're actually worried about it, then your job isn't to make yourself less worried because we live in a democracy. Your job is to think just for a little bit about how with any dollar or minute you have, you can have the biggest possible outcome. And if you think about that, you will find it as states. Now, look, the states project exists to make it easier for you to find that impact in states. The book is an attempt to make it clearer what's going on so that you feel like you can understand it. Mm-hmm. But if you care about the country and you believe in democracy, participate in it. Don't see your social media feed as a source of emotional despair. See your country as a place that is designed to let you engage if you work at it.
That is excellent. That's excellent. You made a case for democracy as the only legitimate form of gaining power. I want to say, as a supplement to what you said about why people should be involved, it works. When you have a functioning democracy, you get better results for you and the people. If you don't pay attention, then the legislators frequently work for the lobbyists and the guys who draw the maps, and they get the benefit. Right? Because it works. So step in and take the place of the lobbyists and the guys who draw the maps, and suddenly they'll be working for you. And it's amazing what we can accomplish.
And the number one thing that gives them so much power, they try. That's the thing I promise you. The federal government, by the way, it's not true. If you want to go and try to get Congress to take up your issue, and you drive down to DC, you should plan to stay there 10 to forever years. But in the state, the one thing I promise you is if you try, you can be as influential as a lobbyist. You just got to do it.
Yeah. I mean, it is an amazing thing. Amazing thing. All right. Well, Daniel, the book is called The Fourth Branch.
Yes, it is.
Fourth Branch. I should look at my notes once in a while. And it is, as we've been discussing, it is about the way state governments work, why they work the way they work, and how they can work for you.
Thank you so much. It's always
Thank
an honor
you.
to talk to you. Always learn something.